at a time when oceans were feared more than they were understood. One nation learned how to turn salt water into supremacy through sails, silver, and systems of control. Britain did more than trade with the world, it organized it. This is the story of how commerce became command when Britain came to dominate global trade. It was not an accident of geography, nor a sudden stroke of genius. It was the result of centuries of calculated ambition, forged in rivalry, war, and innovation. In the late 17th century, Britain stood on the edge of Europe, smaller than its continental rivals and scarred by civil conflict. Yet its leaders understood a truth that would change the world. Wealth no longer flowed only from land, but from movement. Goods, ships, credit, and information were becoming the new sources of power. Britain invested heavily in its navy, not merely as a defensive force, but as a commercial weapon. Warships protected merchant convoys, enforced blockades, and opened distant ports to British traders. Sea power allowed Britain to bypass traditional empires and reach markets directly, turning oceans into corridors of profit. At home, Parliament strengthened property rights, expanded banking, and encouraged private investment. These financial reforms made it easier to raise capital, insure cargoes, and spread risk, giving British merchants an advantage few could match. Chartered companies became the sharp edge of this system. Backed by the state yet driven by private profit, they blurred the line between commerce and government. Through exclusive contracts and military backing, they secured access to raw materials and consumers across the world. Trade was no longer just exchange, it was strategy. Prices, supply routes, and shipping lanes were carefully controlled to favor British interests. Crucially, Britain learned to connect trade with industry. Raw materials flowed in, manufactured goods flowed out, and profits were reinvested into better ships, faster production, and wider reach. This cycle reinforced itself year after year. By the early 18th century, Britain was no longer simply participating in global trade. It was shaping how trade worked, who benefited, and who was excluded. The foundations of a trade empire had been laid, quietly but decisively, setting the stage for unprecedented global influence. From counting houses to dockyards, a new order emerged, measured in ledgers and tides, where power followed profit, and the rules of commerce became the rules of the world. It would govern lives, shape nations, and define an age of global economic dominance ahead. Britain's control of global trade rested on a single, decisive advantage: command of the oceans. While other powers focused on armies and borders, Britain invested relentlessly in ships, sailors, and navigation. The sea became its shield, its highway, and its weapon. By the 18th century, the Royal Navy was no longer just a military force. It was the backbone of a commercial empire, ensuring that British goods moved freely while rivals were delayed, disrupted, or shut out entirely. Naval supremacy allowed Britain to protect its merchants from piracy and enemy attack, reducing risks that made trade cheaper and more reliable. Insurance rates fell, shipping schedules stabilized, trust grew. This reliability mattered as much as firepower. Merchants across the world preferred to trade with a nation that could guarantee delivery, enforce contracts, and punish interference. British flags en masse signaled security as much as authority. Control of strategic choke points transformed geography into leverage. Narrow seas, key ports, and island bases became tools of influence. By positioning fleets where global routes converged, Britain could decide which ships passed and which did not. During wartime, blockades strangled rival economies. During peace, naval presence quietly reminded trading partners who set the terms. Commerce followed power, and power followed the tide. Technological and organizational advances reinforced this dominance. British shipyards produced faster, more durable vessels. Navigation charts improved. Training became professionalized. Sailors were drilled not just to fight, but to endure long voyages and complex maneuvers. This discipline allowed Britain to project force far from home for extended periods, something few competitors could sustain. Naval power also supported expansion without constant conquest. Instead of occupying vast territories, Britain often controlled access. Ports, coaling stations, and maritime routes mattered more than inland borders. This lighter footprint reduced costs while maximizing influence. Trade could flourish without direct rule, yet always under British protection. By mastering the seas, Britain reshaped global trade into a system that rewarded maritime strength. Oceans no longer divided continents. They connected them under British oversight. Every sail on the horizon carried more than cargo. It carried the quiet understanding that trade flowed where Britain allowed it, and prosperity followed the routes its ships controlled. The sea, once a barrier to power, had become Britain's greatest instrument of global command. Behind Britain's visible fleets and bustling ports lay a quieter force, less dramatic but equally decisive: finance. Trade empires are not built on ships alone. They are built on trust, credit, and the ability to move money faster than goods. Britain understood this earlier and more completely than its rivals, transforming finance into an instrument of global control. London emerged as the nerve center of this system. Banks, insurers, and investors clustered around its docks and exchanges, creating a web of capital that stretched across oceans. Merchants could borrow to fund voyages, insure against loss, and reinvest profits with unprecedented speed. Risk, once a constant threat to long-distance trade, became manageable. Failure no longer meant ruin. It became part of calculation. The development of modern credit gave Britain a decisive edge. Bills of exchange allowed merchants to trade without carrying silver across dangerous seas. Debt could be transferred, divided, and delayed. This flexibility accelerated commerce and expanded its scale. While other economies remained constrained by hard currency and local markets, Britain operated through paper promises backed by state confidence and naval power. Crucially, the government itself became a partner in finance. Public debt was organized, regulated, and respected. Investors trusted the British state to honor its obligations, even during war. This credibility allowed Britain to raise enormous sums quickly, funding fleets, subsidizing allies, and sustaining long conflicts without economic collapse. War, paradoxically, strengthened Britain's financial system. As victory reinforced trust and trust attracted capital, insurance completed the structure. By spreading losses across many investors, Britain turned danger into opportunity. Ships could sail farther, faster, and more often. New routes were tested, new markets were opened. Finance did not merely support trade, it encouraged risk-taking that others could not afford. This invisible power reshaped global exchange. Prices were set in London. Credit decisions made in counting houses determined which regions prospered and which stagnated. Wealth flowed through British institutions even when goods did not pass through British hands. Control no longer required ownership of territory. It required command of money. By mastering finance, Britain extended its reach beyond cannon and canvas. It ruled not just the movement of ships, but the movement of confidence itself. And in a world where trade depended on belief as much as force, that may have been its greatest advantage of all. Britain's command of global trade was strengthened by a transformation at home that changed production forever. Industrialization turned workshops into factories and merchants into industrialists. This shift allowed Britain not only to trade widely, but to supply the world at a scale and speed never seen before. Mechanized production reduced costs and increased output. Textiles, metal goods, and machinery poured from factories, ready for distant markets. Steam power freed industry from rivers and seasons, making production constant and predictable. This reliability mattered. Traders could promise delivery dates, standard quality, and consistent prices, reinforcing Britain's reputation as the world's most dependable supplier. Industry and trade fed each other in a powerful cycle. Overseas markets absorbed manufactured goods, while raw materials flowed inward to keep machines running. Profits were reinvested into better technology, larger factories, and improved transport. Canals, roads, and later railways linked industrial centers directly to ports, collapsing the distance between production and export. This system reshaped labor and society. Workers became part of a global supply chain, their output tied to demand thousands of miles away. Decisions made in counting houses affected lives in factory towns, binding domestic stability to foreign markets. Trade was no longer external to society. It penetrated everyday life. Industrial dominance also altered competition. Rivals found themselves trapped as suppliers of raw materials or consumers of finished goods. Britain controlled not just routes, but value. The most profitable stages of production remained at home, while others were locked into dependency. Crucially, industrial power reduced Britain's reliance on territorial conquest. Influence could be exerted through market access rather than direct rule. Economic pressure often achieved what armies could not. By setting terms of trade, Britain shaped development elsewhere without constant warfare. Through industry, trade became a machine, efficient, relentless, and expanding. It amplified every advantage Britain possessed, turning innovation into influence. The world was no longer simply connected by trade. It was reorganized around British production, British standards, and British priorities. all driven by factories whose impact reached far beyond their walls. This industrial engine powered an era of dominance that reshaped economies, expectations, and global balance permanently worldwide. As Britain's trade network expanded, it did more than move goods. It imposed systems. Trade requires rules, and Britain ensured those rules served its interests. Through treaties, tariffs, and standards, markets across the world were drawn into a framework designed in British boardrooms and government offices. Commercial agreements opened ports while limiting local competition. British merchants received favorable terms, legal protections, and predictable enforcement. Local producers, by contrast, often faced restrictions that prevented them from competing on equal footing. Trade appeared open, but it was carefully structured. Access existed, yet advantage remained firmly British. Standardization became a quiet form of control. Weights, measures, contracts, and currencies were aligned with British practices. This reduced friction for British firms while increasing dependence for others. To trade efficiently, partners had to adapt. Over time, entire economies adjusted their production to meet British demand rather than local need. Markets were also reshaped through consumption. British manufactured goods flooded overseas markets at prices local artisans could not match. Traditional industries weakened, replaced by imports. Regions that once produced finished goods became suppliers of raw materials and buyers of foreign products. The balance of value shifted outward, profits flowing back through British financial channels. Law reinforced this structure. Commercial courts, maritime regulations, and dispute mechanisms favored established traders with legal expertise and capital. Economic power translated into legal authority, embedding inequality into everyday transactions. Trade was presented as neutral exchange, yet it consistently produced unequal outcomes. This system delivered stability and growth for Britain, but at a cost borne elsewhere. Economic choices narrowed, dependency deepened, local development followed paths set by external demand. Prosperity became uneven, and resilience weakened. By shaping the rules of trade, Britain extended its influence beyond ships and factories. Control no longer required constant presence. It was embedded in contracts, standards, and expectations. Global commerce operated freely, yet within boundaries Britain had drawn. The world traded, but Britain decided how. At its height, Britain perfected a powerful idea: control without constant conquest. Unlike earlier empires built on direct rule, Britain learned how to dominate trade across regions it did not formally govern. Influence flowed through access, finance, and dependence rather than permanent occupation. Free ports, treaty zones, and commercial hubs became extensions of British power. These spaces were designed for efficiency and profit, insulated from local politics yet deeply influential within them. British merchants operated with legal protection, stable currency systems, and naval backing, creating islands of certainty in an uncertain world. Trade followed these islands, pulling surrounding economies into their orbit. Informal influence proved cheaper and more flexible than empire. Without the cost of administration or large garrisons, Britain could shift attention as markets changed. When demand moved, so did investment. When rivals challenged routes, naval power intervened briefly, then withdrew. Control was maintained through presence rather than permanence. Trade networks also carried ideas, business practices, accounting methods, and commercial norms spread alongside goods. Local elites who participated in these systems gained wealth and status, aligning their interests with British trade. Collaboration replaced resistance, not through coercion alone, but through incentive. This model reshaped global power. Britain could exert pressure by altering tariffs, restricting credit, or redirecting shipping. Entire economies felt the effects of decisions made far away, yet responsibility remained diffuse. Hardship appeared as market fluctuation rather than political choice. By decoupling trade from direct borders, Britain created a new form of dominance. Power became mobile, adaptable, and difficult to challenge. Rivals struggled not against armies, but against systems embedded in daily economic life. This approach allowed Britain to maintain influence even as political control fluctuated. Trade endured where empires faded. Routes outlasted regimes. By mastering commerce without borders, Britain ensured its presence was felt far beyond the reach of its flag, woven into the rhythms of global exchange itself.
Britain's dominance of global trade created extraordinary wealth, but it did not distribute that wealth evenly. Every system that concentrates power also produces imbalance. As trade expanded under British control, the world was divided into beneficiaries and dependents, often separated not by distance, but by position within the trading system. For Britain, the gains were immense. Ports thrived. Cities expanded. A growing middle class emerged, tied to commerce, finance, and industry. Cheap imports raised living standards at home, while profits from overseas markets fueled further investment. Trade became a source of national confidence and political stability. Elsewhere, the effects were more complex. Regions integrated into British trade networks experienced growth, but often on narrow terms. Economies were reshaped to serve external demand, leaving them vulnerable to price swings and distant decisions. When markets shifted, livelihoods disappeared. Prosperity came with fragility. Social divisions deepened. Those connected to trade benefited disproportionately, while others were left behind. Traditional forms of production declined. Skills passed down through generations lost value almost overnight. Communities that once sustained themselves became dependent on imported goods in volatile markets. Environmental costs followed. Intensified extraction of raw materials, altered landscapes, and exhausted resources. Short-term profit took precedence over long-term balance. Trade accelerated change faster than societies could adapt. These outcomes were not always the result of deliberate cruelty. They emerged from a system designed to maximize efficiency and profit, not equity. Yet the consequences were real. Inequality hardened. Opportunity narrowed. The promise of global trade was undermined by its structure. Britain's trade empire demonstrated that economic power could reshape the world as profoundly as conquest. It connected distant regions but also entrenched divisions. The same routes that carried goods carried disparity. The same markets that created wealth reinforced dependency. By the 19th century, a divided global economy had taken shape, reflecting the priorities of its dominant trader. Understanding this legacy requires recognizing both achievement and cost, and how closely they were intertwined within the machinery of global commerce. Britain did not control global trade unchallenged. Its dominance provoked rivalry, resistance, and adaptation from other powers determined to break its hold. France, the Netherlands, and later rising industrial states studied British methods, copied its finance, improved their fleets, and searched for weaknesses. Competition intensified as markets expanded and profits grew. Trade, once a shared opportunity, became a battleground of influence. Wars disrupted routes and tested Britain's system. Blockades, privateering, and naval clashes exposed how dependent trade was on security. Victory preserved access, but conflict raised costs and uncertainty. Even success strained resources, forcing constant investment in ships, crews, and technology. Trade power had to be defended continually, not assumed. Economic change posed quieter threats. As industrialization spread, other nations reduced their reliance on British goods. Domestic factories emerged, tariffs rose, and protected markets narrowed opportunities. Britain's commitment to open trade left it exposed when rivals chose restriction instead. The very system Britain had promoted now limited its leverage. Social pressure followed economic strain. Workers faced insecurity as competition increased. Prices fluctuated, wages tightened, and unrest grew. Trade, once a source of confidence, became contested at home as well as abroad. Political debate questioned whether dominance could last without reform. Yet Britain adapted. It renegotiated agreements, retooled industry, and sought new markets. Finance remained resilient, shipping innovative, and institutions flexible. Decline was predicted repeatedly, but postponed through adjustment. Still, the era of unquestioned control was ending. Trade was becoming multipolar, shaped by many centers rather than one. Britain would remain powerful, but no longer alone at the center of global exchange. The challenges of rivalry marked the beginning of a slower, more contested age, where influence had to be negotiated rather than imposed, and trade reflected balance instead of dominance. This shift did not erase Britain's legacy, but it redefined power itself. Control now depended on cooperation, credibility, and adaptation. The world Britain had organized through trade was learning to operate without a single conductor, signaling a transition toward modern globalization, where dominance softened into influence, and history moved forward under shared pressures and competing ambitions, reshaping the future of commerce and power worldwide permanently.
By the early 20th century, the system Britain had built began to strain under the weight of global change. The mechanisms that once guaranteed dominance now revealed their limits. Trade supremacy depended on stability, yet the world was entering an era defined by disruption. Industrial rivals had matured, financial centers multiplied, and economic power was no longer concentrated in one capital. Global conflict accelerated this shift. Large-scale was redirected production towards survival rather than commerce. Shipping lanes became targets, not highways. Debt mounted, markets fractured, and confidence weakened. Britain could still trade, but no longer on its own terms. Decisions increasingly required coordination rather than command. The rise of economic nationalism further undermined Britain's position. States sought self-sufficiency, protecting domestic industries and restricting imports. Open markets, once Britain's greatest advantage, became liabilities. The global trading system fragmented into competing blocs, each prioritizing security over efficiency. Technological change also altered the balance. New industries emerged that were not tied to Britain's traditional strengths. Innovation spread faster, reducing the gap between leader and follower. Control of trade routes mattered less when production and consumption diversified geographically. At home, the costs of maintaining global influence grew harder to justify. Public expectations shifted towards social welfare and domestic investment. Trade remained vital, but it could no longer dominate national priorities as it once had. The empire of exchange slowly contracted, not through sudden collapse, but through gradual reorientation. Importantly, Britain's decline in trade dominance did not mean irrelevance. Its institutions, legal frameworks, and financial practices endured, embedded within the emerging global order. Influence persisted even as control faded. The unraveling of supremacy marked the end of an era, not the end of impact. Britain had demonstrated how trade could shape world power, and its retreat revealed how fragile that power could be. What followed was a more complex, negotiated global economy, carrying the imprint of Britain's system even as it moved beyond British command. The age of control gave way to an age of interdependence, setting the stage for the modern world economy that continues to evolve today. When Britain no longer controlled global trade, the world it had shaped did not disappear. It endured. The roots, rules, and institutions forged during its dominance continued to structure global exchange long after supremacy faded. This was Britain's final influence. Not command, but legacy. Global trade had been transformed from scattered exchange into an organized system. Standardized contracts, financial credibility, maritime law, and market expectations survived the empire that advanced them. Nations that once resisted British dominance now operated within frameworks it had helped normalize. Power shifted, but the architecture remained. Britain's story revealed a deeper truth about global commerce. Trade is never neutral. It reflects the priorities of those who design it. Britain proved that economic systems could achieve what armies alone could not: reshape societies, redirect development, and define winners and losers across generations. Its success showed the potential of trade as a force for growth. Its decline exposed the limits of control in a changing world. The consequences are still felt. Modern globalization echoes this earlier era, with familiar debates over fairness, dependency, openness, and power. The questions Britain confronted: who benefits, who decides, and at what cost, remain unresolved. The world continues to negotiate the balance between cooperation and dominance, efficiency and equity. Britain's trade empire was neither purely heroic nor purely destructive. It was complex, ambitious, and deeply human. It connected continents, accelerated progress, and concentrated power. It built prosperity while entrenching inequality. Understanding this history is not about nostalgia or blame. It is about clarity. Because today's global economy did not emerge by accident. It was built, piece by piece, by choices made in ports, parliaments, and counting houses centuries ago. Britain's experience shows how profoundly trade can shape destiny, and how quickly dominance can give way to change. The story of when Britain controlled global trade is ultimately a story about influence, responsibility, and consequence. And as the modern world debates its economic future, this past still speaks, quietly but insistently, reminding us that the systems we build today will define the world tomorrow. If this story deepened your understanding of how trade shapes power, consider supporting the channel. Like the video, subscribe for more in-depth historical documentaries, and share your thoughts in the comments below.